In the winter of 1812, a group of men, armed with hammers and axes, broke into a textile mill in Nottinghamshire and destroyed every loom they could reach. They were not criminals by any ordinary measure. They were skilled craftsmen, men who had spent years, sometimes decades, mastering a trade that now threatened to erase them entirely. The authorities responded not with negotiation, but with soldiers. Within 2 years, the British Parliament had made machine breaking a capital offence. You could be hanged for smashing a loom. The question worth sitting with is not why the men broke the machines. The question is why the machines frightened the state enough to answer with the gallows. To understand what was happening in those mills, it helps to understand what work had meant for most of human history. For centuries, the production of goods, cloth, metal, grain, leather, was inseparable from the human body. Skill lived in the hands. A weaver did not simply feed thread through a frame. He read the tension in the cloth, adjusted for humidity, compensated for the particular weight of the yarn, made hundreds of micro-decisions per hour that no written instruction could fully capture. That knowledge was embodied, transmitted through apprenticeship, protected through guilds, and it gave skilled workers something that is easy to underestimate from a distance: bargaining power. You could not simply replace a master weaver. There were not enough of them, and training one took years. This scarcity was not incidental. It was the structural foundation of an entire economic relationship between labor and capital. What the Industrial Revolution introduced was not just new machinery. It introduced a systematic attack on that scarcity. The spinning jenny, the power loom, the steam engine, each of these technologies shared a common economic logic beneath their mechanical differences. They transferred skill from the worker into the machine. Once a complex motion could be encoded into gears, levers, and rotating shafts, the human being operating the machine required far less training. A child could be taught to oversee a power loom in days. An adult with no weaving experience whatsoever could manage a spinning frame. What had taken years to learn now took hours to supervise. The embodied knowledge of generations was not made obsolete overnight, but the economic advantage it provided, the leverage it gave workers at the bargaining table, began to erode with each new patent filed in London. This was not lost on the mill owners who adopted these machines earliest. The records of early manufacturers like Richard Arkwright reveal a deliberate calculation that went well beyond productivity. Arkwright did not merely want faster cloth production. He wanted a workforce he could discipline, schedule, and replace. His mills at Cromford were designed with a specificity that went beyond engineering. Shift patterns, time discipline, fines for lateness, rules against conversation on the floor. The machine was not just a tool of production, it was a tool of labor management. When a spinner's skill was embedded in the machine rather than in her hands, she became, in the economic language of the time, interchangeable. And interchangeable workers cannot command the wages that irreplaceable ones can. The numbers that emerged from this shift were staggering in their human weight. A hand loom weaver in England in the 1780s could earn enough to support a modest family. By the 1820s, the same labor, now competing directly against power looms, had seen wages collapse by more than half in real terms. The weavers did not disappear immediately. The transition took decades. But during those decades, hundreds of thousands of skilled workers found themselves in a peculiar and agonizing position. Their craft still existed, they still practiced it, but the market for their labor was being systematically undercut by machines that could produce more, faster, at a fraction of the wage cost. They were not unemployed. They were economically suffocating in slow motion, continuing to work while the returns to that work declined year after year. Step inside one of those handloom cottages in Lancashire in 1820, and the texture of that suffocation becomes visible. A single room, often, where the loom occupied the center of the domestic space. The sound of it, a rhythmic thudding that visitors invariably remarked upon, was the sound of a family's economy in motion. The weaver himself might work 14 hours, his wife preparing bobbins, his older children assisting. The output of that household, that integrated domestic economy, was genuine and skilled. But at the market, it was competing against a mill that ran through the night, powered by a steam engine, operated by workers who earned less and produced more per hour than any cottage could match. The weaver knew this. He could see the mill from certain hills. He could read the price lists at the cloth market. The mathematics of his own displacement were not abstract to him. They arrived every week in the form of a slightly lower price for his cloth. Meanwhile, the mill itself presented an entirely different kind of human experience. The workers who entered those buildings in the early decades of industrialization were not, by most accounts, the beneficiaries of a productivity revolution. They were, in many cases, former agricultural laborers, displaced rural workers, and, in a detail that remains genuinely difficult to absorb, children.
The early cotton mills ran on child labor not as a scandal concealed from polite society, but as an openly acknowledged economic practice. Factory commissioners in the 1830s documented children as young as 5 working in textile mills, their small bodies useful precisely because they could reach beneath moving machinery to retrieve broken threads. The machines had not just replaced adult skilled workers, they had restructured the entire labor hierarchy, creating new categories of work that were designed around what the machine needed, not what the human being was capable of. The factory floor in this period was a genuinely new kind of human experience. Before industrialization, even hard physical labor had a certain rhythmic variability. The pace of harvesting adjusted to weather, to fatigue, to the natural constraints of the crop. A blacksmith's day had an internal structure determined partly by the work itself. The mill abolished that variability. The machine set the pace, and the pace did not negotiate. A power loom running at full speed required constant human attention, at a tempo determined entirely by the mechanism. Workers described the experience of factory labor as qualitatively different from anything that had preceded it, not merely harder, but differently demanding, in a way that removed from the worker the last residual autonomy over how their time was organized within the working day. The machine did not just replace human muscle, it replaced human judgment about the rhythm of the work.
Produce cloth that would have required dozens of hand weavers to match. The total volume of textile production in Britain roughly tripled between 1770 and 1840. More cloth existed in the world. It was cheaper. More people could afford it. By purely aggregated measures, something genuinely expansive was occurring. And yet the workers who generated that expansion, those who fed the machines, maintained them, and filled the factories that housed them, saw comparatively little of the wealth it created. The gains flowed upward, toward the owners of capital, toward those who possessed the machines themselves. This was not a conspiracy. It was the mechanical logic of a system in which the scarcity of labor had been deliberately engineered downward, while the productivity of capital had been engineered upward. When labor becomes abundant and machines become essential, the price of labor falls and the returns to machine ownership rise. The distribution of productivity gains is not a natural outcome. It is a structural consequence of who owns what. What the Luddites understood and what their destruction of machinery expressed in its raw and violent way was precisely this structural reality. They have been caricatured in subsequent history as men who simply feared change, as technophobes resisting an inevitable and ultimately beneficial tide. But the historical evidence suggests something more precise. The Luddites did not object to machinery in general. Several of their leaders explicitly distinguished between machines that made their trades more productive and machines designed specifically to undercut skilled wages. The target of their anger was not technology itself, but the deployment of technology as a tool of labor suppression. When Parliament made that anger punishable by death, it was not protecting progress. It was protecting a particular distribution of the gains from progress, one that favored capital over craft, owners over operators, the machine over the man who had once done what the machine now did. By 1830, the shape of the transition was becoming visible in the demographic data. English cities, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Sheffield, were filling with populations that had no precedents in human history. These were industrial working classes, people whose entire relationship to production was mediated by machinery they did not own, operating in spaces they did not control, at a pace determined by mechanisms indifferent to their physical or mental state. The craft traditions that had structured economic life for centuries were not gone. Pockets of skilled handwork survived, and in some trades thrived, but they had been displaced from the center of the productive economy to its margins. The dominant form of human labor was now something new, wage work inside a mechanized system, where the value of an individual worker was determined not by their unique skill, but by their replaceability. And that replaceability had consequences that extended far beyond the factory floor. When a worker can be replaced, the threat of replacement becomes a perpetual disciplinary force. You do not need to actually dismiss people constantly to achieve the effective labor discipline. You simply need the possibility to be credible and visible. The unemployed men gathered outside mill gates in the 1820s and 1830s were not only suffering their own poverty. They were performing an economic function for the owners inside. They were the living demonstration that workers were in fact interchangeable. Their presence depressed wages and undermined collective action simply by existing. The machine had not only replaced certain workers, in replacing them, it had created a structural surplus of labor that redefined the power relationship between employer and employee for the entire industrial economy. What no one in 1830 could fully see, and what makes this period so difficult to assess from a comfortable distance, is where this logic would ultimately lead.
The machines that displaced handloom weavers were themselves tended by workers. Those workers organized, agitated, eventually won concessions. New industries emerged and absorbed displaced labor. The story did not end in the catastrophe that many observers of the 1820s predicted, but neither did it resolve into the clean narrative of mutual benefit that later economists would sometimes construct around it. The disruption was real, the suffering was real, and the structural dynamics that produced them, the way technology, capital ownership, and labor markets interact to determine who gains and who loses from productivity, did not disappear. They evolved, they became more sophisticated, and they have never, at any point in the 2 centuries since those first mills began to run, produce a simple or self-evidently just answer to the question that the weavers were already asking in 1812 with hammers in their hands. When a machine takes what you do,